Hello, my name is Greg J. Smith, a Canadian writer and cultural worker with Holo. Today I'm joined by Toronto-based writer, curator, and arts administrator Belinda Kwan, who I'll introduce shortly. And this is the second episode of the 2024 edition of Alt History, which is an online speaker series exploring lost and forgotten moments in digital culture. So if you've been with us in the past, I don't need to explain what this session is about, but for those that haven't joined us before, when I say alt history, that's one, a nerdy Usenet reference, but two, this is kind of how we think about the series. This idea that new technologies and cultural developments are often synonymous with erasure. We forget about why or how we used to do things and what words or communities meant. So addressing moments, practices, and labor that have faded from memory or been outright forgotten over the last 3 decades, what we've been doing with this series is not just waxing nostalgic about the past, but critically engaging this erasure and forgetting and using it to make sense of the present. So the series is brought to you by Generation, which is a Braga, Portugal-based space for creation, performance, and exhibition with the domain of contemporary music and the relationship between art and technology, and my team at Holo. We are an editorial and curatorial platform founded in 2012, focused on tracking kind of all the good stuff across art, science, technology, and culture. And these interests manifest themselves in a few ways. We make periodicals. We've published a few beefy digital art anthologies over the last decade. Online at holo.mg, we track interdisciplinary practice in an evolving timeline. And as you're reviewing right now, we collaborate with cultural partners, exactly like you're watching today. So thanks again to Generation for the invitation to host this series. It's been really rewarding and fun. So I'm thrilled to be joined by Belinda Kwan, who is a peer and somebody I've worked with for a few years. And I'm always kind of, struck by your insight and compassion, who will be talking about digital refuge, notions of access, and disorientation. So Belinda is a neurodivergent curator, writer, and arts administrator based in Toronto. She currently works at the New Media Artist-Run Center Interaxis. Her art writing and curating work has appeared in Canadian Art, CBC Arts, Art Asia Pacific, Backflash Magazine, and Bloomsbury Collection. So Belinda, please take it away.
Hey everyone, and thanks for having me, Greg and Diego, as well. Yeah, today I'll just be talking really briefly about disability justice and how it's manifested online. And I don't claim to be an expert at all. I just want to present how I came to um, realize my own positionality in digital art and new media, the things I still struggle with, and the things that I strive toward. And so working in an artist-run center as well in the Canadian context, that's sort of a nonprofit charity environment that I sometimes tell my corporate friends is a little bit like a startup, but has a bit of a cross between um, I guess, a responsibility toward grassroots communities, but also is in that strange position of being a nonprofit and having to deal with all the things that formulate what some scholars and activists have called the nonprofit industrial complex. Um, so just a little bit about me beyond my bio. Ever since I was young, I think I've always been informed by a relationship to the digital, primarily through my father, which I write about in the Black Flash magazine article that Greg talked about. My father was diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease when I was 2. And we had immigrated from Hong Kong. Um, my brother's 10 years older than I, so 7 years before I was born. And so watching my father as a child, as his disability progressed, I really saw him rely on remote forms of community, whether it was talking on the phone, um, as digital media progressed as well. looking online for community. He was a huge photography enthusiast. Speaking of media arts, um, and so I watched him, learn to share photos online, um, form these connections, social relationships, all while staying at home, as his social life changed along with his disability. I think as well for me, even though I only relatively recently received a kind of diagnosis for my neurodivergence and disability, um, I feel I've always had had it and relied on remote forms of communicating with people or forms of digital world building online. I had the luck of having a very tech savvy brother. So he taught me how to download video games on my computer, speed torrents and things like that. And um, this is something I didn't really connect to my interest in art until I started really working with Interactus or um, associating myself with Interactive. In 2020, I curated a show called Filling the Time Bottle at Interactive, where all of these things came together, like these concepts of world building, exploring through the digital, and etc. But beyond these, I think more fun aspects of being on digital, like uh, I guess access through digital media. It was also through Facebook and these forms of social media that are very full of conflict and sort of like this irony of the fact that these are techno-capitalist um, giants. But through these techno-capitalist giants, ironically, I found also um, my first introduction to disability justice. And, really huge figures for disability justice communities, I would say at least, such as Mia Mingus and Alice Wong, and the spoon theory story, by Christine. I often forget how to uh, pronounce her last name. I think it's Mr. Randino. Um, Through that, I found a sort of refuge and realization of my disability. And it was something that I had found nowhere else, certainly not in my immediate settings. Um, I thought I just always had a kind of struggle with being productive, fitting in. Like there were social struggles as well that I experienced um, that I didn't really make sense of and come to terms with and accept until I encountered things like spoon theory, and quick justice and disability justice. So just I'm dropping a lot of terms here. So I'm going to explain spoon theory a little bit. So the spoon theory is a concept that was uh, coined by Christine Mr. Andino in the like in 2008, I believe. We might have to fact check that, but in 2008, on an online blog. And Christine had been, you know, struggling, I guess, to explain um, this experience of chronic illness, and settled on this theory called the spoon theory to talk about it with peers. So the spoon theory describes the idea of limited energy using spoons as a unit of energy. And I think just even being able to see someone else um, go through the process of having to explain limited energy was something I'd never experienced before. Um, and, you know, as I kind of got to know this online community on disability justice, I also, began to understand that there are other people like me who have developed all these tools for advocacy to talk about disability and advocate for others as well. And I think this wouldn't have been possible without having this online access. So that brings me to where I am today, in the projects that I run, which have to do with fostering, I guess, community, and support for cultural conversation, by disabled cultural workers. And a huge learning that I've had throughout this process is that online programming such a has such a huge set of barriers as well. You know, online methods are only one way of, bridging the gap of access, because some folks prefer the in-person, and in-person is, supportive to certain disabilities as well. And so I think huge learnings that I talk about in my Black Slash magazine, article, for example, are, um, thinking about the digital divide, and, also about how in online settings, like, we're relying often on these techno-capitalist structures to facilitate access, and what that means. And what that means to resist it, but also leverage it for survival. And sometimes those things, don't work out neatly. I think we jump back and forth between, um, feeling conflicted, boycotting, and then jumping back in when the tools, make sense for us. And so, yeah, like there was this question that was asked, that really spurred the article, asked by artist Christina Battle, who hails from, so-called Edmonton in Canada, um, who called, not called out, but called in the artistic community in a previous Black Flash editorial, um, about what does it mean for the art world to turn to platforms like Zoom, Facebook, X, um, uncritically during COVID. What does it mean when we sort of pat ourselves in the back for a quick transition to the online? And it's a question that I still struggle with today, um, because these kinds of platforms, have been so essential to the way that I've approached cultural community. But also knowing that, things that are happening in Congo, for example, are very much driven, by, you know, unethical, parts mining that make our digital access possible. So these are very uncomfortable questions that I continue to sit with, and, that I think has brought me to this current conclusion, although provisional, which is that we pick up tools and we lay them down according to what is most relevant at the moment. And so digital media for me is not the only tool for building community between disabled folks, but it is a tool that can be leveraged when the time matters most. And we have to consider what are the costs and what are the benefits of the tools that we use in the spirit of the folks that we want to support, disabled and otherwise. Um, you know, and I think that's something in terms of digital media that all folks are always thinking about. But, within the disability justice perspective in particular, um, this idea of the access issue with access is all the more, I would say, intensified. In working on this kind of thinking in my day job as well, one key tension that has come about is that tension between disability justice, access, and knowledge stewardship, for instance. At Interactive, I've been running projects that seek to cross-pollinate knowledge between Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities. And what I've really learned from that is that with these different values that are being negotiated, um, all-inclusive access is not always the answer. Um, Always putting the pedal to the metal on access can hurt certain communities. Um, and not just certain communities, but it can hurt your community, even if that community has once benefited from online intensified access before. Um, so it's all about kind of negotiating those boundaries and in particular, recognizing that um, analog and digital methods of interaction can learn from each other, but also have very distinct dimensions of access and knowledge stewardship. Um, I've found often folks that I work with who haven't had the chance to sit back and think deeply about online access have either thought about it as something extremely foreign that they can't connect to, when in fact, a lot of the protocols that apply to in-person anti-oppressive settings, such as confidentiality, such as checking in frequently with folks, calling in versus calling out, they apply to the online setting. But at the same time, knowledge stewardship, it plays out a little bit differently. There are conversations that are a little bit more technical with cybersecurity that I think benefit from a meeting between analog and digital, old and new, and just the learning together of um, what is considered traditional, maybe not technology anymore, but traditional ways of knowing and being and working together efficiently, not necessarily efficiently in the capitalist sense, but how did we make things work well, right? And we need to learn from both sides of the old and the new. So yeah, I mean, I'm reaching my end of my time here, but I think one of the um, best learnings I've had in 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 this overall, when we think about new media, when people who don't work in the arts ask us to define it, or even when we get into arguments with each other or like back and forth about what new media is, um, I think what I really learned is that new media is not just about like what's up and coming and emerging, but some of the newer ways to understand and use older technologies, um, older ways of like community technologies, for example, thinking about how social relationships scale, like thinking about that kind of history, thinking back to those online blogs that folks like Mia Mingus and Christine Mr. Andino ran, and saying, hey, what is valuable in this other than the digital nostalgia? At the time when these blogs were new, how did these folks use them? And I think we can apply those same principles to the newer technologies that exist today, such as, Web3, NFTs, etc. They're not the community aspect of these things are not new. We can draw from those older protocols and simply like think about the technical aspects that need to be merged with our older community knowledge. So that's a little bit about my work and thinking.
Great. That was very insightful. And I was really struck by a lot in there and a lot to zoom in on. And thank you for providing the setup for spoon theory, which maybe we'll come back to. It's definitely worth investigating for folks at home if you want to kind of like get a sense on this like energy economy that Belinda was talking about and points to spend or something like that. It's really great and super accessible. But what I was really struck by the way that you talked about like during the pivot online in the aftermath of COVID, which was maybe a moment that everything changed forever on the internet, how uncritical it was. But I like how you framed that as resisting and leveraging, simultaneously used, but maybe not be used by these platforms. So I'm hoping this can be a through line in this conversation we're going to have, this idea of like, okay, this is the world we have. These are the technologies we have, but like, can we do some good or at least mitigate some harm with them? So I have a first question. It's a bit of a mouthful, but I'm hoping you can kind of share a little bit, and this will kind of plumb the depths of some of your experience a little more. In preparing for this session, I found a paper called Chronic Media World, Social Media and the Problem of Pain Communication on Tumblr. And Tumblr is a social media platform. It's very near and dear to my heart. Anyways, this scholar, Elena Gonzalez Poletto, did ethnographic research in 2016. I guess for about 2 years, she just explored how people were living with chronic pain and illness on Tumblr, and just kind of engaged them and saw how and what they were sharing, the tenor and tone of it. And she talks about how Tumblr was the latest in a long line of confessional technologies and how it created what she called pain worlds that displaced the need to define pain through biomedical frameworks and demonstrate its realness in an everyday manner. And that basic argument was just that, like, by engaging this stuff, these conditions or lived experiences that you maybe may not understand from afar, you just kind of soak up the everyday reality of what this is like. So we'll link to that alongside this video for sure, and Belinda's essay, which you referenced. So I'm wondering, Belinda, if you could talk a little bit how you have engaged. You talked about a couple blogs, and maybe this will be discussing, your discovery of them and your learnings from them. But how you've engaged the internet and digital communities around chronic illness over the last decade and a half, and how they've shaped how you live with and communicate that to others.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and what a great article as well. Um, it's funny because yeah, when I give talks about this, or talk about it in a professional setting, it's such a strange feeling because it's so incredibly personal. Um, sometimes it'll literally be that I can't sleep, and I'm looking for ways to out my anxiety, and thinking about my disability in complex and grieving ways when I'll look something up by Mia Mingus or look something up by Alice Wong for encouragement, or like look up the science. It sounds really, you know, almost silly, but it, it's this it's this act of seeking encouragement from others, and being able to rationalize the difficulty of um existing in a world with disability. But it's also, as I've found myself in a position where I'm called to like support folks, even if just administratively or program wise in the cultural world, um, like folks with disabilities, it also helps me foster a greater sense of empathy. Um, because the toughest thing to admit is that when when I struggle with my disability, I feel selfish, I feel selfish and I feel like I don't have community. And sometimes it feels like I just want to shut myself away and experience like the toughness on my own. So it's typically a very tough and vulnerable, it's the tough and vulnerable moments that bring me to these kinds of things. It's not really an imperative to do research or, an imperative to put things out into the world. And in fact, like for a long time, even still, I get this feeling that I don't know if I want to work in disability justice profession. Because even with the Black Flash article, it was so difficult to write emotionally. To not just have it be a therapy session with the readers of the article, um, and to intellectualize the difficult feeling of disability. I still am not sure how I feel about that sometimes, but um, I think what I've come to is just if it can what a corny thing to say sometimes I feel, but if it can make folks feel less alone about their experience and say that their experience is worth talking about, then it can be worthwhile in that way. Um, and so yeah, like the pain world concept, I think it it really boils down to this question of do you want to share your pain with others, right? Because it's a double-edged sword. Um, it can get into something where, at least for me, I spiral into like a bit of hopelessness. Um, but at the same time, there's a use to it. It makes people feel seen. In a professional setting, I think it means that, um, yeah, like it means a complicated relationship to this idea of slowing down. I think there's a very popular notion of slowing down in digital media right now of care. But strangely, I've learned that sometimes you really need to speed up uh, to urgently care for others. If someone's flailing and they need support, you actually need to move faster. There's actually not a chance to slow down, or else someone will not get the support that they need. Um, and I think moving mindfully is actually a massive privilege. I think I've learned actually it's sometimes quite over romanticized, because the fact is we're surviving in a capitalist world. So I, I will actually say that interacting with digital media, I appreciate the speed because I can support people more quickly. Um, so yeah, I think that's kind of been my experience um, in terms of negotiating and engaging with these online worlds, um, and these ideas of pain world, right? I think also the immediacy of online interaction, it means you can be there for someone faster. I use this tool where people can book meetings with me on the fly. Like even within 15 minutes of wanting to book a meeting with me, they can book a meeting with me right away. And some folks have used that like when they feel anxious and they need to like talk to someone right away. Um, and so yeah, I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about when it comes to like the social worlds that digital media allows.
Okay, great. Okay, well, we'll come back to productivity and speed and moving mindfully, I think, a little bit. But I want to just open things up for a second. We'll kind of come back to the arts in a second. But I'm just wondering, like, okay, so I referenced Tumblr. You talked about these, these I guess thinkers and around disability justice that kind of were blogging, more than a decade ago. Blogging has mostly gone the way of the dodo. Tumblr, which was referenced in that paper, kind of got paved over by Yahoo. I'm just wondering if you like, what do you like? Because you also like Notion. You referenced with a great deal of kind of like wonder, kind of this '90s internet you saw through your father. So I'm just kind of wondering, like, because like I mean it feels like everybody that everyone knows to varying degrees is traumatized by being online now, or beleaguered by the productivity or great life they're supposed to project to others. I'm just wondering how you kind of think about kind of the you're talking about a lot of like intention and care provision and helping and supporting each other, but like I mean, how would you assess the kind of state of the internet right now in terms of like offering support? Like, I mean, this might be a bleak question. I'm just kind of curious. And it's a huge,
Yeah,
but I'm just curious to see kind of where you grab onto it. Yeah.
yeah. So a funny thing is that currently I'm taking I'm part of a tech boot camp,
Okay.
which is like a very hyper capitalist
Right.
accelerated way of learning technical skills, and it's supposed to launch you into a job in the tech world. Mind you, right now, all over the world, there are lots of tech layoffs and
Yeah.
um, we're in an economic downturn and such. And so I've been thrown into this environment where I try my best to, mask my disability and everything's about the customer, the profit orientation. Um, and, you know, again, like this critique is nothing new, the speed of capitalism, the efficiency of capitalism, not in the sense I was talking about like the efficiency to go and help people directly, but the kind of efficiency that brings people right to spending their money and giving it to corporations and paying for products, this efficiency to consumerism rather than an efficiency to community. Um, I think like I don't disagree with it's corny, but like Hal Foster and like the critique of design and things like that, of almost being stuck in this limbo of doom scrolling across ads and social content that reflect your own psyche, but is kind of peppered with ads and um, sort of promotes online scrolling repeatedly with no impact, rather than thoughtful um, and balanced um, consideration of what's being shown. Um, I think, the state of the internet, um, I think in order for it to be of use to folks, um, I think it returns back to this idea of it's a tool, it's just a tool. Um, and to assess it as such. What are our desires for ourselves and the folks that we care about around us and the communities we care about, and how can we think about how the internet does or does not serve us in that way, and how can we push for an internet that serves us. um, this sometimes means we need to like balance stepping back and stepping in uh, to what the internet is. Um, and that's for every tool. Like, to use a very simple metaphor, if you use a hammer or something, if you use it repeatedly, there's going to be strain, right? You gotta put it down sometimes. Um, and that's not some kind of brilliant insight, but I think it's helpful to compare it to that sometimes because we get used to the tools we use and then we forget that there's a way to potentially redesign it or there's a way to pick something else up. And right now, I don't know if I can find a a nice metaphor for this, but right now the internet is designed to suck you in so you
Yep.
can't step out of it. And I think it's about finding time to step out of it and thinking about it a bit more critically while not necessarily foregoing it completely.
Yeah. I like the tool bit because like I mean if you think about like maybe the way that journalists might have thought about or talked about the site formerly known as Twitter a decade ago, they would have called it a tool. But it's interesting because like not many of the platforms out there you could really call them a tool anymore. Like maybe Facebook on some level for familial collections, but like TikTok and Instagram are just kind of like malls. Like they're not things you can do things with. They're places you go and like you said, get seduced by the scroll. Okay, that's thoughtful. I'm kind of I think we might come back to some of this in a bit. Um, I guess okay, so that was a specific conversation. You kind of talked about moving online during the pandemic, and I guess we can steer things back towards arts a little bit. I'm just wondering if you could talk about like because every art organization, and we're recording this over Zoom right now, and whether Generation or Interaxis or Holo, we've all done X things through Zoom and all these other online platforms. Kind of thinking back on the rush online during the pandemic in the arts, I'm just wondering if you could like, it sounds like you've developed a lot of thinking about digital tools and platforms through your work, which we'll talk about in a little bit at Interaxis and these programs you've set up. But I'm wondering, like, just could you assess kind of like um, the uncriticality. You talked about the uncriticality of all these orgs just moving all their programming online. Again, we're using Zoom now. Like just What could orgs be maybe doing or thinking about when they're kind of thinking about what tools they use and how to use them, like you said, exactly, like resist, but also leverage. Just and it's I'm imagining you've got some thoughts on this, so I'm curious.
Yeah, yeah. I was citing Christina Battle on the arts organizations moving uncritically.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with her,
Yeah.
but yeah, I won't lie. I think the first time I read that article, I was frustrated because it almost felt like we're so under-resourced. Like, where do we even find the time to be critical about these digital tools that we're using? Like, we don't always have the time to stop uh and think about stuff a lot. Especially when people are trying to make money to pay rent, to
Yes.
buy food. And yeah, it's been something that I continue to struggle with, which is the fact that thinking critically is it takes a lot of time. It takes immense privilege, and it has a great cost time wise when you're living in capitalism. Um, and so I think really it's about, at least from my professional side, it's really creating opportunities and spaces for folks to be able to think that. I think that is the responsibility of folks who hold power. Um, I think people need to be supported in their thinking around digital media and new media. I don't think, I think the call is important to think critically, but when we write grants, when we pay folks, um, like how do we leverage like space, make room? Um, how do we, yeah, I'm trying to find a better word than leverage, but like how do we sneak in those opportunities for critical thinking while still acknowledging that we survive in capitalism and it's a very tough and accelerated ride. Um, and how I've sort of tried to do it is to pay people a lot more for a lot less work, acknowledging that it's the intent, like acknowledging the intensity of critical thinking, putting less emphasis on deliverables and output where I can, making room for, all this sounds very boring, but making room for long delays, which, yeah, often we just want chop, chop, chop. We want the project to end, but, um, you know, where I can as a project manager, protecting folks from the speed. But the ironic part of that is it means I need to work incredibly fast,
Yeah.
right? And so that's sort of where, um, yeah, this kind of strange dynamic comes in. Um, I think also it comes to that essential question of, is the use worth it? I think challenging ourselves to justify our use of techno-capitalist tools, um, can we justify? Is a question we need to turn to more. Um, because sometimes I think it can be justified, right? For example, I think there's a group of folks, and I appreciate their work very much. I don't know if I can take their approach. And I'm talking about the folks who say, like, let's fully divest from these tools.
Yeah.
Let's build our own platform, from the ground up. I very much support this work. I think a lot of different approaches are needed, but sometimes I'm like, well, but the captioning is not as robust. Well, sometimes we don't have the budget to pay for captioning, so we must rely on auto captioning. And I think there needs to be, again, that consideration of when those tools are relevant and the access is worth it, and then when it's not. I know a lot of disabled folks who rely heavily on ChatGPT, and it's not a perfectly ethical thing to do,
Yeah.
but it helps them survive. It helps them to stay like able to keep on top of their jobs. And, it's constantly about, can I let go of this tool? Is this tool serving me? Is it serving my peers? Is it serving the community?
Yeah. I mean, so I know one thing that sprung to mind there, we were just talking about like, when and in what context, I guess, bringing some criticality to the decision making. Like this is like about maybe a banal example, but like I think about like, when xarts.org leaves Y social platform, it makes a big exit. I think about like Transmediality, the Berlin-based festival a few years ago. Like I think they're like, we're not doing social anymore. Maybe they're still on Insta, but they like left Facebook and X, and all they do is newsletter. And on one hand, you're like, that's awesome. I'm so with that. Like, don't I because I personally hate the idea of some arts worker sitting there having to adapt text to announce something on 3 social networks where it's going to be throttled how many people can actually see it. And that's like wasting 3 hours of their time. But on the other hand, like transmediality is like a very storied, it's kind of the equivalent of like Radiohead, releasing their music for free as MP3s. Like, okay, yeah, but you're really successful. So I'm just like I like what you said there about like this idea that, oh yeah, let's build our own platform from the ground up. And I too would cheer those people on, but also like they don't have the network effect of being able to reach, however troubled and however throttled, some larger audience. So I mean, is this something you ever like? It sounds like you're looking like in your own work and own practice. You're like, how can I use more tools smartly rather than necessarily thinking about some like moral dilemma about, I don't know, what does anything like cross the line for you in terms of any of the platforms you might use? You just talked about like, okay, the auto say the auto captioning and something like Zoom, and you can't afford somebody to do it, so you kind of that's you use that. But are there any platforms you wouldn't engage? I'm just kind of curious.
I think the line is always changing.
Yeah.
And what constitutes the line for me, um, I mean, there's an obvious statement. It's different for everybody, right?
Yeah.
But I think what is encouraging to me is that we all have different sorts of approaches. And me not boycotting someone while someone else boycotts it, like I think that actually offers a very important balance. So I will never not support someone like boycotting a thing, even though I may not be boycotting it. Um, it's hard to give an objective answer to that for me because I think we all try to support anti-oppressive um, resistance or like community building in our own way.
Yeah.
And our morals are always changing and the ethical system of the communities that we belong to are always changing. So I think it's not very measured, honestly. Like I think it's about always asking yourself the question, asking others the question, um, of what's worth it and what's not,
Yeah.
and challenging yourself and challenging others. And sometimes that's super uncomfortable. Someone may challenge you in ways that you're not comfortable with, but it's about, I think, being open to that, and keeping that sort of challenge productive as well. It's not always about um, feeling comfortable. Um, so yeah, that's really all I can say
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I just, yeah, one of the things that kind of irks me is the kind of unthinkingness often in the arts. And that you made the case, and everybody that's worked in culture kind of knows there's never enough resources, there's never enough time. It's always such a hurry to like, it's a luxury to think critically about the tools or platforms you're using. But like, the pandemic in particular, like just the rush online to like always specific platforms. Oh, Clubhouse, or Zoom, you know what I mean? Like there was these moments and then they come and go. Um, and you just, I don't know, I guess we're predisposing the artists to go where the people are kind of regardless of that because we want to try to connect with them. I just find these tensions between actually being able to or not and these mediated capitalist platforms problematic. Okay, let's talk about your rhizomatic pedagogies project a little bit, which is again, we'll provide a link to the backflash essay because that touches on learnings from it. And you introduced it as this project to kind of educate the educators from Black, Indigenous, and disability justice communities, all basically traditionally woefully underrepresented in the art world. And in your essay, you talked about how platforming these folks was painfully slow and foregrounded the many inadequacies and orientations towards productivity that consist in cultural production. And yeah, I was wondering if you could just kind of like maybe elaborate on that project a little bit. In the end of your essay, you write that high speed, high volume output isn't everything, and that stopping or moving slowly can help us uncover new directions for care and consideration. So just wondering if you could reflect a little bit on some of the learnings from that process and that project, and how do you see institutions needing to change to meet the entire spectrum of artists and arts workers where they're at? Again, another huge question, but I know you think about this every day, so I feel like I can get away with it.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's interesting because like slowing down is valuable, and I ended up putting that in the essay. But my sentiments about like that balance between sometimes having to work incredibly fast to support folks, it's something I felt I couldn't make room for. But I felt it at the time still. Um, and so yeah, like that project, even the projects that I run right now, like I always feel like I'm actually working too slow. Um, and I often feel overwhelmed by such projects as well. Because there's just so much to think about. I keep on thinking about like what are people's needs and like what if I make the wrong move? There's a lot of overthinking in the process. And so I guess just to pedal back a little bit. So Rhizomatic Pedagogies was a project that was initially conceived as a educational program or capacity building program for arts educators who were hoping to learn more about new media and program new media. And it came out of my position as the education and outreach coordinator at Interaccess, recognizing that we were really resource strapped and we weren't able to make room for more of an accessible space, firstly, in the new media workshop, but also in the sense that a lot of the people we were working with, wonderful, talented, thoughtful people, they were very privileged because this demand of combining culturally rigorous conceptual ideas with technically rigorous work, it's you have to be privileged to be working in that intersection. Um, and it just felt sort of off to always be pushing like so many workshops and always be working with folks who are already tenured profs. And then going to workshops and supporting them, and then folks like not working with the latest operating system, struggling to like install things that like folks who have the privilege of lots of technological access, um, like easily just install like routinely. Um, so rhizomatic pedagogies, kind of tried to leverage like some of the funding that was coming out in response to COVID. In particular, this one was the Canada Council for the Arts grant called Digital Now, which allowed people to adapt existing programming for the online or create new programming for the online. And so I kind of envisioned it as a cohort-based program that was two-pronged, like one prong being closed um, cohort sessions with new media instructors, and then another uh, prong being public programming that the cohort could attend for free, and kind of mingle with public audience to learn about new media. Um, Honestly, yeah, it's strange to talk about the project because I feel like I didn't succeed, right? Like, even though there were like lots of, I think, valuable things that came out of the project, I'm almost like haunted by like how inefficient I was throughout it. Um, and yeah, like I read about this in the that Black Flash essay, but a lot of the most valuable things that came out of that project were not actually intended for the project in the first place. So, for example, one of the things that I was really excited to have come out of the project is something I just called the note-taking program, which was hiring artists and cultural workers, like prioritizing Black, Indigenous, and disability justice-centered cultural workers um, to attend events that they're interested in for their own research, and then get paid to take notes on that content, and then share it with the cohort and the public members of audience. Just, as simple as implementing that I mean, that in a very like university setting kind of way, how universities have note takers,
Mhm.
but having that like creates paid opportunities for artists. It makes it so that they're not attending events just out of like unpaid time, but they're paid for it. And it also fosters like a sense of community because folks are from the arts are being tapped in to make the space more accessible. It's like weird structural things like that came out of the project that ended up making it valuable, or like creating like a set of community guidelines came out of that, like a code of conduct for interactive, because I was thinking about how, we didn't actually have the foundational structures to ensure safer space to fall back on. And because of all of this like structural thinking, I think the programming ended up taking a back seat a little bit. It took a really long time to like, get the programming off of the ground. Um, all the programming ended up being packed into a June. Um, and so a lot of lessons learned. Um, and I guess one primary lesson learned, which I don't even know if I can say with confidence though, is that sometimes like especially like with disability justice oriented projects, uh in addition to working on what would be referred to as crip time, like slower movements to accommodate folks, um it's also accepting that the outcomes of a project might completely change. And while that's an obvious statement that a lot of project managers talk about all the time, with all the talk about agile projects,
Yeah.
staying abreast of changes and stuff, um, I think one thing that isn't talked about is sometimes there's disappointment that comes with the communities we serve in not meeting the original project deliverables, or not as well as we had hoped. Right? Like in mounting the project, I feel like having packed all the programming into June, like there's folks who missed out. Right? Even though like another part of the project that was kind of exciting was that it was the first time we attempted to make things very robust in terms of asynchronous um, sharing. So like everything was uh, captioned, recorded. We're still in the process of doing this, but captions refined, transcripts refined, not only in terms of grammatical errors, but like in terms of cultural sensitivity issues being flagged. Um, but all of that still, it's like I almost feel like the cohort members didn't get to experience as much of a sense of community because a lot of things were so delayed. Um, so yeah, it was full of learnings, I think, logistically, but I think community wise as well. It really taught me, I keep on talking about time, right? Everything takes so much time, but, and the realizations seem obvious, but, I don't know, like one of the main things um, I was really faced with was the fact that at the beginning of the project, I was so enthusiastic about how these communities like had overlapping knowledges. But it takes a lot of time for knowledges to cross-pollinate, and it takes so much time to make the cross-pollination careful and considerate. I really like, I think words like intersection, words like cross-pollination, it makes it seem so easy. But it's constant negotiation. It's like learning about each community for all its complexities and then identifying where the common ground is. And not only identifying the common ground, but having folks like learn from each other, even as I'm learning from them. Um, cross-pollination, intersectionality. It's like if you're gonna if you're gonna make that into something that's community building and constructive, we have to like reevaluate and build like system structures that allow for that. And I think so many programming projects, they don't teach you how to do that. Like you just run a panel kind of thing,
Yeah.
and then the panel's over, and then it was cross-pollination. But yeah, like before running the programming, I thought, okay, what if, what if we created community protocols? What if we incorporated like a terms of mediation to every contract? Like that stuff took a really long time. Meanwhile, like the cohort members understandably so, they were emailing me all the time being like, when's the first workshop coming out? Right. And me feeling like a disappointment and like, um, and it's perfectly understandable that they felt if they felt the program was right. Not saying that they necessarily did. No one told me this program was a disappointment, Belinda,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, there's a cost. There's a cost to slowing down.
That's that's you've left me stunned in thought now there. I might need a second to digest that for a moment. Yeah, just hearing you talk about like the way artworks works, like I know that we talk about interactions. Some places actually do have somebody that's in charge of like wrangling community and community managers, a team we see, our term we see everywhere from fandoms to like software communities and stuff. But it's funny, it's not still not a thing mostly in the arts. Yeah, because I know that arts organizations are traditionally short-staffed, but that seems to be something that kind of falls down the middle when arts orgs are thinking about their public and who they're serving and how they interface with them. Um, it's not a question, it's just kind of feels like a pressing oversight given kind of the sensitivity and care you just communicated around thinking through, you know, a programming initiative and actually, again, another term that's cliched and thrown around, meeting people where they are, but truly doing that. Like it's not something that really fits in the framework of, you know, I did X, Y, and Z, and then we execute the project is exactly that. And then you write the grant report saying you did exactly as things were intended. And I know that things go sideways in arts projects a lot, but yeah. And one last question, and how and I again, so you kind of come to these realizations and kind of doing this big project that was glorious and complicated and a success in some way and maybe frustrating in others. How do you kind of carry the backflash piece and kind of reflects on it and some autobiographical learnings? How do you kind of carry that into to future arts projects that you're associated with? Maybe I've been using you to try to diagnose what's wrong with the cultural industry, and that's not productive. But like, what are your kind of immediate takeaways? You talk about like, knowing when to move slow and when to move fast and when to resist and when to leverage. What are you pulling out of, yeah.
Um, yeah, sometimes I'm still not sure, you know. I think in in recent um I think in recent times the learning that's most grounded for me is just learning to advocate for myself and for others. Um, and that complex relationship between that. Because sometimes, yeah, as someone who's supposed to be supporting community, like I feel like I have to pick it up, you know, and just support other folks. But I will say, like in recent days, it's been incredibly difficult. I feel like the people that I'm supporting are supporting me, you know, and it felt the same in rhizomatic pedagogies as well. Like the cohort members, like I was supposed to be running this program that's supporting them, but like they were also supporting me. Like they were incredibly gracious with the delays. Um, they were encouraging. Um, and you know, thinking about that, that's such an important learning, right? Like you are also being supported by the people that you support. But I think the complexity in that is that I'm very privileged to have a salary position doing those, right? Because even though I'm being supported by the core members, I'm being paid a salary to support. They're not being paid to support me. And that's a very difficult irony to come to terms with. Um, as a disabled arts worker and arts administrator. That I can't even pretend to have come to terms with that. Um, yeah, that's one thing. The other thing I think is I'm trying to wrap my head around a little bit what it might mean to leverage systems thinking in a way that's less oppressive. Because I think that, yeah, the reason why there's not a lot of community managers and ARCs is because everybody's a community manager, right? Like in every interaction with an ARC that is amazing, it's typically like all the people who are there at the moment, like, oh, like I know Rob.
Yeah.
Oh, and but this person knows like Michael, that sort of thing. It's like we all develop like our own organic relationships working in an ARC, which I don't think can be completely captured by community manager. And I think this is a good analogy, I guess, for how I'm trying to get a sense of how some system thinking can benefit um, artist front centers because I think there's a resistance against systematizing because systematizing can be incredibly oppressive, and it can be very rigid in ways that do not serve us. So I'm trying to find that balance. Like, what does it mean to implement guidelines, for example, that can offer people a launch off point so they're not always reinventing the wheel once they hire new staff or something.
Hmm.
But how do we keep those guidelines flexible enough so we can change our ways when uh, the socioeconomic community uh, uh, context calls for it? Um, and that's difficult to do because I think a lot of people that work in the arts have been hurt by systems, and that's why they're working. Maybe this is an assumption, but this is at least my observation and assumption that uh, I do feel that a lot of people appreciate the arts for its non-systematic ways, which are
Yeah.
very valuable. So I'm trying to find that balance and trying to learn how to advocate or approach systemization that still allows for grassroots innovation, grassroots criticism, and stepping back.
Okay. Great. Well, we can hear that little melodic fanfare that burst in about a minute ago that we're at time for today. So Belinda, I'd really like to thank you for your time and generosity and for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it was fun. And folks that are watching on YouTube, the next edition of Alt History will be taking place in September after the summer. So thanks again. Bye.